1:11, and our title today is going to be on Guard. And we're going to talk about what we're supposed to be on guard about for here just a little bit. So we are still in Matthew, and we're in chapter 16, and we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 12. And and really we're going to focus kind of on this first sentence and then the last sentence. And we're going to look at what that means for today. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. He replied, "When evening comes, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah." Jesus then left them and went away. So the one thing that struck me about this is the Matthew version of this, as opposed to the Mark version of this, includes the Sadducees. And this is important, because we've talked about this before. Who are the Pharisees and Sadducees? Who are the Pharisees?
Conservatives.
They're the religious, political conservatives of the time. Who are the Sadducees? They're the liberal, religious, political liberals of the time. That's important, because what we see here is that, and I'm going to tread lightly here. I'm going to tread lightly, but not too lightly, because there's something to really think about here. Politically, did Jesus have a place to land? No. At this point in time, he did not Now, for the first 350 years of the church, did they land anywhere politically? Did they have a voice politically? No, they didn't. When they finally did in the 4th century, what happened to the church?
Oh, it got ruined. The Roman Catholics.
Right, it ruined it. Right? So that's important, because we need to think we live in a unique situation in Western civilization where Christians at times have a voice politically. And the question is, how do we treat that? Right? How do we treat that? Now, one of the things that we have to be considerate of is the fact that throughout the history of the church, there have been times when the church has not had a voice politically. In fact, there's probably as much time that they didn't as they did. Right? We can look at the Waldensians. Right? Look at the Waldensians. You can look at the Anabaptists when they started baptizing. You can look at the First Baptists. They were persecuted in America.
Right. That's right.
Right? So we got to look at, there's times, and so we have to consider that possibility. That's one of the things we have to consider, the possibility that there will be times when Christians, just like Jesus, do not have a political place to land. Or theological, because one of the other sides of this is, these are not, when we talk about that they're the religious conservatives, what we mean is they're theologically conservative and theologically liberal. So there have been times when true Christians, not only did they not have a political place to land, but they didn't have a socially acceptable theological place to land. Does that make sense? There was not where correct Christian theology was socially acceptable. Right? So we're going to talk about that some more in just a little bit. All right. So when he talks about them is these are supposed to be the religious, political leaders of the time, right? And he makes the point of, you can't see what's right in front of your face. Right? You can't see what's going on right in front of your face. So just because somebody claims to be a religious leader, just because somebody claims to be a political leader, doesn't mean they actually can see what's going on in front of the face. And we're well aware of that. All right, but going on from there, when they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. "Be careful," Jesus said to them, "be on guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." They discussed this among themselves and says, "It is because we didn't bring any bread." Now here the disciples, not only were the Pharisees and the Sadducees fairly dense about not being able to see what was going on in front of them, the disciples, on the other hand, were fairly dense and could not see what was going on in front of them.
They weren't ever reading the signs themselves, were they?
Right, they weren't.
Never.
And this is kind of what Jesus is saying. And this is one reason, one of the things we do have to understand, though, is that Jesus says, the only sign that's going to be given to you is the sign of Jonah. What he's talking about there is where Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and came out. And basically he's saying, just like Jonah, was in the belly of the whale, I'm going to be in the belly of the earth. And he said that's the ultimate sign. And a lot of people who didn't get it before then did get it after then. Of course, the disciples, they really, truly didn't completely get it until the resurrection. There were guys like Nicodemus, who was the Pharisee, who really didn't get it until after the resurrection. There were Jesus' brothers, who really didn't get it till after the resurrection. So we do have to cut them some slack here.
That's right.
You know what I mean? Is that he said the one sign you're going to get, and they hadn't got that sign yet. So when they got that sign, a lot of people got it who hadn't got it previous to that. So we give the disciples a little bit of slack here in that they really, truly didn't really even understand what was going on yet. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, "Ye of little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I was talking to you about bread? Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." All right, so he reminds them back to, he just fed the 4,000. He reminds them back to the feeding of the 4,000, feeding of the 5,000. We talked about this before. We talked about this last week. In the feeding of the 5,000, they gathered together. It was a preaching ministry, and they gathered together 12 baskets of bread. And anytime you see 12, that's the nation of Israel. And this is really looking at, this is him, the son of David, the physical king of Israel to be. Then you go forward to the feeding of the 4,000, and I didn't mention it like I should have, and Daryl reminded me last week that he collects 7 baskets, and the 7 is always, it's perfection, but when you first go back to it, it's creation. So why would he do 7? It's to prove that he is the creator. He is God himself. And we talked about that previous to that, he had been a healing ministry where he was regenerating people's bodies. Right? And so, who's the only person that can regenerate people's bodies? It's the Creator. And as he does the 7, so he's like, look, 12, hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. 7, hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And they right over the heads. They're riding around in a boat with God.
Fully human, fully God. Is it clicking it off?
Right. And they're like, oh, we forgot bread again. And he's like, what are you worried about bread for? Right? Now, when we talk about yeast, there's sometimes yeast is used as a positive, but most of the time, yeast is used as a negative, right? That yeast is also often viewed as contamination, right? So he's talking about the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He's talking about the teachings of the Sadducees and Pharisees and how it will contaminate. Because he goes on to say, then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now we said, this is interesting because the Pharisees and the Sadducees are on 2 extremes from one another. Hey, come on in, man. Hey, man, how you doing?
Good.
Hey, good to see you, friend.
How you doing, man?
Yeah,
now I remember who you are now. He told me you knew who I was, and I was like, I can't remember it, but I see you. I know who he is. Good to see you, man. Good to see you. All right, so we're talking about Jesus warning the disciples against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, one of the things, again, about the Pharisees is that they are, at that time, they are the religious, political conservatives. The Sadducees are the religious, political liberals. Now, so they don't teach the same thing, right? They're not teaching the same thing. So what does he mean by the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees? So what do they have in common? What they have in common is that they teach extreme views devoid of discipleship of Jesus. Does that make sense? Well, because we hear and we say, well, they're the religious political conservatives. Well, that doesn't sound bad. Well, if it's the religious political conservatives devoid of discipleship of Jesus, there's the problem. And on the other end, same thing. If it's devoid of Jesus, there's your problem. Because if you think about this, again, we in this area, we tend to lean towards the conservative side, right? With the danger of that is, when we lean towards the conservative side, it is generally based off that we agree that there should be law and order. That there should be structure, there should be rules in place, people should follow the rules, right? Now, we've talked about this before with the Old Testament. What's the purpose of rules? Is it just to have rules? Or just to have law and order? No, it's to protect people. The danger of conservatism is that you worry about the rules without worrying about the people that the rules are there to protect. That the rules themselves become an idol. That you care nothing about people whatsoever. All you care about are that the rules are kept. That's the danger. And that's where the Pharisees were. They got to the point originally, they're like, we need these rules in place because these rules are given to protect people. But they had developed to the point where they cared about the rules and they didn't care how the rules hurt anybody. Right? All they cared about, they had made an idol out of their rules. Same thing on the Pharisee side, on the Sadducee side. The Sadducees was a worship of personal freedom. Again, personal freedom, do what you want to do, without any regards to how it hurt people. Right? And again, that's what you see on the liberal side. You get to this point where you worship personal freedom to the point you say everybody should have personal freedom to do whatever they want to do any way they want to do it, without any regards to how it has a negative effect on society or how it has a negative effect on people.
Or abortion, like on children. It's
right.
Like, yeah.
Again, it's just this extreme, these two extremes, and what it is, it's the extremes devoid of any thought towards being a disciple of Jesus. So one of the things we're going to look at, and we can talk about our modern perspective, but I want to do that and show that this is not the only time. This is the only time it happened at the time of Jesus. Today's not the only time it has happened. And we're going to look at a passage from, y'all know what the Screw Tape Letters are? C.S. Lewis. This is where he writes this fictional story to where it's a mentor demon writing to his nephew demon about how to sideline a guy who has become a Christian. Right? This demon was in charge of making sure this guy didn't become a Christian. Well, he became a Christian, and so now his uncle demon is telling him how, okay, he got saved. You messed up and he got saved. But let's talk about how we can sideline him and keep him from getting anything done. Okay, so this was written around the time of World War II. It's actually in the early days of World War II, right? And one of the things we forget often is sometimes we think that America is the only nation that's ever been founded on Christian principles. England has at times been more overtly Christian than America has been. We got to realize this is where Spurgeon comes from. This is where Hudson Taylor comes from. This is where John Wesley comes from. This is where Whitefield comes from. There have been great Christians who have come out of England. There have been great revivals that have happened in England. C.S. Lewis at this time had a weekly radio show. He was basically considered the Christian conscience of England. Right? England was overtly Christian. That's not to say that everybody was Christian, but it considered itself to be a Christian nation. So we should not look at this and say, yeah, but that's England. Right? And we're America. They were more Christian at times than we have been. They outlawed slavery before we did.
Good point.
You see what I'm saying? Okay. So this is around the time, early World War II, right? And so the debate that was going on in England, now we look at it and we say, well, how could there be a debate about whether or not to fight Hitler? Okay, y'all realize, one, they didn't realize how bad Hitler was. Right? Well, he was racist and didn't like Jews. No white people in Europe, all of them were racist and didn't like Jews. Not all of them, it's an exaggeration, but you get my point. Yeah. Right? It wasn't such a horrible thing to them that he was racist and didn't like Jews.
Right.
They didn't know what he was doing to Jews in concentration camps. They didn't know about that. They didn't know that he had gone through and killed all the not just Jews, but that he had gone through and killed all the mentally ill people. He had euthanized all of them. That he was throwing even Jehovah's Witnesses. Before he got to the Jews, he threw the mentally ill, he killed the mentally ill and threw the Jehovah's Witnesses in concentration camps before he ever got to Jews. Right? So he was doing a lot to more than just Jews. They didn't know about that. Right? And they were like, well, what is he doing that's so bad? He's just rebuilding the military of his country. He's just rebuilding his country up back to what his people want it to be. They're just taking pride in their country. What's so bad about it? Right? And that was the debate because they didn't really know. They didn't really know everything that was going on in Germany at the time. Right? So there was this debate going on in in England about whether or not they should be fighting a war against Germany. Because if y'all seen this where Neville Chamberlain goes and he tries to work out a peace deal with Germany, and he comes back and he's got the peace deal in his hand, and everybody's happy because they're not going to have to go to war with Germany. You got to remember, people like C.S. Lewis had fought in World War I. All these older guys had fought and seen the horrors of World War I, and they're like, we really don't want to do that again. Right. So there were a lot of people who were opposed to fighting against Germany. Now, so what happened was people started involving Christian theology into that. They were saying, as Christians, we shouldn't be going to war. Then on the other hand, you had people saying, as Christians, we should be going to war. Right? And that was the debate that was going on at this time in England when he wrote this. Okay, so you get that? So you have that in your mind. So really what you had is you had the left and the right. You had the left who were pacifists at the time saying we shouldn't be going to war. right?
Peace, peace.
Right. And so that's what was going on. So here's what the one demon, and again, it's a fictional story. We know this really don't happen this way, but it's a good story, right? So he writes, the one demon writes to his nephew, I had not forgotten my promise to consider whether we should make the patient an extreme patriot or an extreme pacifist. All extremes, except extreme devotion to the enemy, which when they say the enemy, they're referring to God. It's not our enemy, it's the demon's enemies, right? Are to be encouraged. Okay? Because remember what we talked about, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they're at these two extremes without Jesus.
Right.
Right? All extremes except extreme devotion to the enemy God are to be encouraged. Not always, of course, but at this period. So he's saying sometimes, that's not works. He said, but at this period in time with what we got going on, if we can get them to extremes and fighting each other, that's what we need to be doing. Some ages are lukewarm and complacent, and then it is our business to soothe them, yet fast asleep. He said, so when there's not a war going on, you don't want to shove them to extremes. You want to just get them kind of laid back, easy, being like, yeah, peaceful life, not worried about anything, don't stir anything up. Other ages, of which the present is one, are unbalanced and prone to faction, and it is our business to inflame them. If your patient can be induced to become a conscientious objector, he will automatically find himself one of the small, vocal, organized, unpopular society, and the effects of this on one so new to Christianity will almost certainly be good. Okay, but only almost certainly. So what he's saying here is, we want him what we would call today a progressive. If you can get him to be a progressive Christian, he's going to sound so loony that nobody's going to pay attention to what he says. Right? Which is pretty much true today. Yeah, people get swung to, I know them. I know them. I know a couple of them personally, I know them. Swung so far left that you're looking at them going, what you're saying is just ridiculous, man. It makes no sense whatsoever. It's crazy. There's a series of articles coming out. A guy goes to Bobby Harrington's church. He's actually the worship leader at Bobby Harrington's church, where he went from Southern Baptist to a progressive and then came back. But he's wrote his first article. If you see, it's on renew.com. It's really good. He's talking about how he gets over there, and then when he gets over there, he realizes how crazy it is.
His eyes are open.
And he comes back, right? And so, but anyway, so what his first thing trying to do is swing him over here to this extreme passivism or this extreme progressivism, because you're just going to completely and totally sideline him. He said, so one so new to Christianity will almost certainly be good. The effects on this will be good, and he's talking about their good to the demon's good. But he says almost certainly. He says, but there's a couple caveats to that, and he goes on to say, has he had serious doubts about the lawfulness of serving in a just war before the present war began? Is he a man of great physical courage, so great that he will have no half-conscious misgivings about the real motives of his pacifism? Can he, when nearest to honesty, no man is ever really near, feel fully convinced that he is actually wholly by the desire to obey the enemy, which is God? So what he says is, but if the guy's going to have questions, he's going to get over there and realize how crazy it is. Right? He says, that's what we don't want. We don't want him to go over progressivism or pacifism, realize it's crazy and come back. He goes on to say, if he is that sort of man, his pacifism will probably not do us much good, and the enemy God will probably protect him from the unusual consequences of belonging to a sect. So that's what we were talking about, the guy who's the worship leader at Bobby Harrington's church, where he got over there, realized how crazy it was, and came back. Right? He says if the guy has any convictions, he has any, thinks about what he's doing, that's what's going to happen to him. So we don't want him to go there. He says your best plan in that case would be to attempt a sudden, confused, emotional crisis from which he might emerge as an uneasy convert to patriotism. Such things can often be managed. But if he's the man I take him to be, try pacifism. So he doesn't think he's a man of great conviction. So he's like, try pacifism. He said, but if he is a man of great conviction, so what we're going to do is, if he's a man of great conviction, we're going to cause him some real hard troubles in his life that are going to kick him way over to the far other end of extreme patriotism. Right? Now here he goes on, he says this. Is this making sense?
Oh yeah.
Okay, just making sure, because I'm kind of jumping out on a limb on this one, so That's all right. All right. Whichever he adopts, your main task will be the same. And I put these numbers in. He didn't have these numbered, but I numbered these. So number one, here's what he does. Here's what he does. And he's talking. Now here's the interesting thing. Again, we're talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He said this is on both sides. This is what you do to either end.
Right.
Right? He says, let him begin by treating the patriotism or the pacifism as part of his religion. Okay. So this one doesn't sound that bad. Okay, and that's the point. That's the point. This is just step one, which isn't. So, in other words, what he says is politics becomes, let me say this, religion becomes part of his politics. In other words, did I say that right? I said it backwards. Politics becomes part of his religion.
Part of his religion.
Right, okay. So what he's saying is that, look, then we do this. This is why we're like, I don't understand what this is so bad. You got to find the progression where it gets bad. Do we make political decisions based off religious beliefs? Yeah, we do. That's just you do.
Right.
Right? But he's just saying, okay, that's the first step, but we're going to take it further. Number two, then let him, under the influence of the partisan spirit, come to regard it as the most important
There you go.
part.
You crossed the line.
Okay, so going back to what we said about Jesus. Did Jesus have a political place to land? No, he didn't. Did the church have a political place to land for the first 350 years of its existence? No, it didn't. Have Christians throughout the history of the church not had a political place to land? Right. Sometimes we have, sometimes we haven't. What he's saying here is that get him to the point, not just to where he votes his conscience, his religious conscience when he votes, but where he demands that he must have a political place to land. Does that make sense? To where he fights tooth and nail that he must have a political place to land. Right? Because that will consume him. Does that make sense? Because we have to remember that there are Christians even now in the world who don't have a political place to land. If you're in China, you're a Christian, you don't have a political place to land. All over Asia, if you're a Christian, you don't have a political place to land. Just because we do, doesn't mean that is a given.
Right.
Now here's one reason why I say this. Now, I have no idea what's going to happen. I'm not a prophet. I have no idea what's going to happen. I'm just going to say that right off my head. But I'm going to say, there's a couple possibilities of what could happen. One possibility is, of course, that we could have a revival in America.
Right.
That's one possibility. Right? I'd love it.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I've been hearing about that for 50 years. I've been hearing about the coming revival for 50 years. Right? I'll be glad if it comes. But at some point, I need to consider the possibility
That's right. It might
that
not come.
there's not a revival coming.
The tribulation might be coming.
Right. The tribulation might be coming. Right? And I need to prepare. Now, one, it's not wrong for me to want a revival to come.
Right.
It's not wrong for me to think about what I would do if a revival came. But at the same time, I can't base all of my hope on that. Because that's what I've seen my whole life. My whole life I've seen, one of these days we're going to have a revival, and then we're going to do all these things. We've been sitting around for 50 years waiting for the revival, and we ain't getting anything done because we're sitting around for 50 years waiting on the revival. I'm almost 50 now, and that's what I've seen for 50 years. So we need to consider the possibility of what might it look like if it doesn't come. If it gets to the point, and this is why I say this, so what you see going on politically right now is on the left, they're moving further left. To an insane, just a place that people never thought they'd get to, they're there, right?
Yeah.
Now here's the problem that creates. That leaves a big hole in the middle. Okay, it leaves a big hole in the middle. Huh?
That place is church any land.
Well, here's the thing. On the far right, it's getting harder and harder to win elections. It would be easier to win elections if we moved to the middle. Right? And it could get to the point,
To compromise biblical.
right, it could get to the point where the right side says, hey, you know what? If we move left some, and if we leave the evangelicals behind because they're getting fewer and fewer in number, we move to the middle, we can pick up some of these middle people that these have left behind, and these people will have to vote for us because they ain't got nobody else to vote for. Right? That is now, I would say it's not going to happen in 2 years. I don't even think it's going to happen in 4 years. But really, I'm going to say, and so here's what I'm saying.
I don't know. You might
Well, okay, here's what I'm saying.
Quickly.
Here's what, yeah, it could happen quickly. In the next 2 election cycles, if the right loses more ground, they're going to start looking for a way to make up some ground. Okay, I'm just telling you that is a possibility of what could happen. If that happens, what you're going to find is true Christians, true believers, really aren't going to have a place to land politically.
won't be heard.
Right?
And that goes back to what you started with. The disciples, they were either raised with Pharisee teachings or Sadducees.
Right.
And they didn't, and Christ is coming in with this different, because
Right.
they both, Pharisees, they said Messiah, Messiah, and everyone's agreeing. Yeah.
Right.
But see, Christ is trying to say, no, this is the way it was supposed to be. And they're slow to get it because they were never rooted and grounded
Right.
from either background.
Right. And so we haven't had discipleship in so long that other than some nationwide revival, it's just going to keep sliding. And you're going to get to a point where evangelical Christianity is going to be left out in the cold.
Yeah.
That is, we have to consider that is a possibility.
That's right.
Because it has happened in the past. Okay, so then it gets, and so what he's saying is he wants to sideline Christians by when they lose that place to land, to get so caught up in trying to fight for a place to land. That's all they got the time to do.
Wow.
So he goes on, he says this number 3, then quietly and gradually nurse him onto the stage at which the religion becomes merely part of the cause, in which Christianity is valued chiefly because of the excellent arguments it can produce in favor of the British war effort or of pacifism. In other words, that the main concern becomes having that political place to land, and Christianity is just used as an argument to have that political place to land.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? That's the danger. To where it's not really about following Jesus. And see, this is where the Sadducees and the Pharisees were. They were using, like you said, the argument of the Messiah, the argument of Scripture, as justification for their extreme positions, which really had nothing to do with the Messiah. It just had to do with them. And this is what C.S. Lewis goes on to say. He says, the attitude which you want to guard against is that in which temporal affairs are treated primarily as material for obedience. Okay. Once you have made the world an end and faith a means, you have almost won your man. In other words, when he's not focused on Jesus as the end.
Right. Amen.
When he's not focused on Jesus as the end, but he's focused on what can happen in the world and the position he has in the world politically, the position, and I keep saying politically, but this also goes along with theologically, being theologically, socially acceptable. Because Christianity, this true Christianity, let's be honest, is not socially acceptable anymore.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
And it's not, and it's probably going, and again, aside from a great revival, it's not going to be. It's going to get less and less socially acceptable. He says, once you have made the world an end and faith a means, you have almost won your man, and it takes very little difference what kind of worldly end he is pursuing. So there's what he's saying. He's like, look, I don't care if he's on the left or the right.
As long as it's not Christ at the same
Right. He's like, look, so
Just keep them distracted.
right. So this is where we on the right
Yeah.
tend to falter. We're like, well, as long as they're on the right, we don't care. Right? But the problem is you can be on the right and worship being on the right and be using Christianity as an argument to be on the right and have nothing whatsoever to do with Jesus.
Right.
And it happens. I mean, it happens. And I'll give you, this is the example I can think of. Imagine, because this makes me uncomfortable. Imagine that you're going to be in a jail cell and you're going to have a cellmate. And you're going to be there for a long time. And you can't argue. Can't argue. You're not allowed to argue in this jail, right? It gets you in trouble. So you can either be in a jail cell with somebody who agrees with you politically, but they're not a Christian. right? And you can't argue with them about that. So I'll give you an example for me. So I can be in a jail cell with Ben Shapiro, or like what's his name? Peterson. Can't remember.
Eugene Peterson.
Another guy from Canada.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. So let's just use Ben Shapiro. I can be in a jail cell with Ben Shapiro, who I agree with morally and I agree with politically, but he's not a Christian. He's a Jew, and I can't talk to him about Jesus. It's not allowed. And we can sit there and we can talk about politics, right? But we can't talk about Jesus. Or I can be in a jail cell with somebody who is a Christian, but for whatever reason is turned off by right-wing politics and considers themselves a Democrat or far right or far left-wing moderate or libertarian or something along those lines that I don't agree with politically. But I can't argue with them about political things. And I can talk to them about Jesus, right? We can have conversations about Jesus, but I know and they know in the back of our minds that we don't agree about things politically. Who would you choose to be in a jail cell with?
Yeah, that shows what you said. I'd want the Christian.
Right. But here's the thing. Growing up, I would have told you I want to be in the cell with the guy I agree with politically.
Yeah, because that's what's how you were trained.
Right. That's why I was trained. That was the end.
Right.
Or just beat the guy up and go to solitary confinement.
Right. That's the other way. But you see what I'm saying? Is that I was taught to be so uncomfortable with somebody that I might disagree with politically, that I was more comfortable about somebody I would agree with politically, right? Even though I couldn't have a conversation about Jesus, than to be over here. Now I have people like this that I have conversations with now, that they came to be followers of Jesus, and we agree on being, and we have conversations about Jesus, but they're so turned off by right-wing politics that they're leaning the other way. Right? I mean, so I know, and you know what? The conversation gets uncomfortable sometimes. You know what I mean? But we talk about Jesus. And in the end, the right thing is to say, I would rather be with the guy that we can have this conversation about Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's kind of my point is, I know it's possible to be so caught up in politics, to be so caught up in conservative ideas that I made that a priority. Again, this is the way I was taught. I make that a priority over Jesus. See, and that's what's going on with the Pharisees and with the Sadducees, is they had made their political and religious standing in the community their first and foremost goal.
Yeah, more important than the Messiah who was
Right.
there in their midst.
And so the Messiah is standing right there in front of them,
And they missed it.
and they cannot read the signs of the times.
Yeah. Wow.
Right? They completely and totally missed it. Then he goes on to say, so provided that meetings, pamphlets, policies, movements, causes, and crusades matter more to him than prayers and sacraments and charity, he is ours.
Wow.
And the more religious on those terms, the more securely ours.
Oh boy.
And this is the most disturbing thing. He said, I could show you a pretty cage full down here. And he's riding from hell. He's like, look, see, this is one of the things we've got to get in our mind, is that Satan is fine with people being on the right. He's perfectly fine with people being on the right as long as that's all they're worried about.
Right. There you go.
Right? And we know he's fine with people being on the left. We're comfortable with that. We're perfectly comfortable with that. But where we come from, being conservative as we are, we think we fall into this trap of believing that everybody on the right is there for the right reasons. And part of it is, he's saying, is like, for one, because I can get sucked into it as bad as anybody. I mean, let's be honest with you, I can get sucked in as bad as anybody. And to realize not to make the things of this earth, maintaining power on this earth, maintaining influence on this earth, that I don't use following Jesus as a means to achieve that end.
Wow.
Because that's what the Pharisees were doing. They were using Scripture, the idea of the Messiah, as a means to fulfill their earthly ends. And that's what he's talking about, the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. He's like, look, don't use me, don't use Scripture to try to fulfill earthly means. You've got to focus on Jesus for who He is, understand who He is. Again, he's pointing back to, he says, don't you know who I am? Don't you understand and realize who I am? Understand, and that could, because again, if we understand who He truly is, right? We understand who He truly is. We understand what He truly came to do. Then our end goal is focusing on Him as His disciple, being like Him. And then as we become more and more like Him, teaching others to be conformed to His image. And we talked about this before because that's how we rescue and redeem the image of God within human beings. And that is how human beings bring to God the glory He is due. Now again, I understand, I don't know what's going to happen politically in our country. I have no idea. I can tell you what there's a really good possibility could happen, and it's not going to be pretty. And we could wind up in a place, where we as evangelicals don't have a place to land. We could wind up in that place, 5 to 10 years, we could wind up in that place. To where we are persecuted, to where we're not socially acceptable. I mean, because we're pretty much halfway there. I mean, we're pretty far there anyway about not being socially acceptable, right? To where we're not, and to where we don't have a voice in politics any longer to defend ourselves.
That's what we're going for.
Right.
Wow.
When it gets there, it's not the end of the world.
No, Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Right. Dietrich Bonhoeffer got there.
The confessing church. The Lutherans were conservative, and this is good for our country. He's helping
Right.
the economy. Hitler. He's really, unifying our nation. And he's saying no. And he then wrote Cost of Discipleship because I think that whole thing
Right.
opened his eyes.
Right. See, and that's part of it is what if we get, what if we get to like the church in China?
Right.
What if we get to that point? Well, it's not the end of the world. They're
No,
still
it's not.
meeting. There's still people getting saved. Yeah, they're being persecuted, but they're still there.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm saying is we need, and my point being is that we need to consider that possibility. We need to be prepared. That's what I'm saying. Don't pray for revival. Don't hope for revival. Say, don't not do that. Don't not do that.
Right.
But at the same time, be aware. Read the signs of the times around you. Be aware going on around you. Be prepared for that possibility, and don't get sucked into, because again, I have a tendency as much as anybody. Don't get sucked into just using Christianity as a means to obtain a political or a social end.
Wow. So he says to his disciples, be on guard. It's the teachings that got into their heads prior
Right.
that messed them up, and they couldn't sort it out. So
Right.
that's what we have to be on guard against. The teachings, either from the right or the left, that take us away from the goal
Right.
of...
Right, and just really ask yourself the question I ask myself: am I more worried about what's going on politically than I am worried about discipleship? Just a question to ask myself on a regular basis. Am I more worried about what's going on politically than I am worried about being a disciple of Jesus and making disciples of Jesus? And that's the danger and again, I'm picking on the right side because that's where I come from, but I know people who I have seen the other side as well, to where they've been swayed the other way, and they are more worried about left-leaning politics and achieving that than they are about Jesus. And like I said, I have conversations with them, and it's a very delicate conversation to have because they keep wanting to pull the conversation that way, and then we'll talk about these things, and I'm trying to pull the conversation back to, let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about what it means to follow Jesus. Let's talk about what it means to imitate Jesus, right? And earlier in life, I would have just not had a conversation with them, because I'd have been so turned off by it. I just, But knowing what I know now about being a disciple of Jesus, knowing how to talk about being a disciple of Jesus, I can tolerate the conversation. I can try to have a conversation with them and try to influence them as far as focusing back on Jesus.
Christ-like conversations has helped so much.
Yeah. All right, let's close in prayer, guys. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity. We can come again and look at these lessons from Jesus, Father. We realize that the things that happened in Jesus' day have happened throughout history, and things are happening right now in our country, Father. We really don't know. We don't know what the end is going to be. It's kind of everything's up in the air right now. So we just ask you that as we go through this time, Father, that you would give us the ability to understand what's going on around us. We would be able to read the signs of the time. We would be able to understand where we're going. And if there's a revival that happens, Father, that we would be able to be a part of that, and we would rejoice in that, Father. But if not, if that we're headed into an age of persecution, Father, like many Christians before of us have, that we would continue to focus on being a disciple of Jesus, that we would be brave, and that we would not back down, and that we would give people the message that they need to hear. That as other people are turned off by what's going on in the world around them, Father, they're looking for the answers in Jesus, that we would be there to give them those answers. We ask all these things in His name. Amen. See, it's good seeing you, man.